Okay. Okay, would you roll in a 270 from the smoke, approximately 100 meters away from it. I'll adjust you from there.
Only a tree or bush could hide an enemy ready to annihilate them. Ambushes were the order of the day, and they always ended in a shower of blood for both sides. In this new installment of military history, we're going to reconstruct in great detail 3 important offensives carried out by the Viet Cong. A series of surprise attacks in which the powerful United States Army was totally humiliated by local guerrillas. Put on your bulletproof vest, grab your M16, and let's get started. Although the official activities of the United States Army in Vietnam began a few years later, a Special Operations Commando Group was established in the Southeast Asian nation in 1964. This was the MASS4CRED, a unit composed of elements of the Navy SEALs, Marines, and members of Special Forces. During its 8 years of activity between 1964 and 1972, MASS4CRED carried out high-risk missions that, despite their importance, were not reported to the general public. In order to operate and keep its structure secret, the group was divided into 3 geographically delimited subcommands: the Northern Command and Control, or CCN, the Central Command and Control, or CCC, and the namesake Southern Command, also called CCS. It was at one of the most important bases in the northern section that the Viet Cong carried out one of the most brutal attacks on the Western invader, in a day that will remain forever in the memories of those who survived. Next, we will listen to the memoirs of John Stryker Meyer, one of the most recognized veterans of the legendary MASS4CRED.
During that attack, it came after midnight. It was a moonless night, and the sappers, who were highly trained NBA soldiers, hit the base.
FOB-4, or Forward Operations Base, was a top-secret operational headquarters of enormous importance to Washington. Its role was fundamental for the organization of missions in one of the most conflictive areas of Vietnam, which is why Green Berets and other top-level commandos who cooperated with MASS4CRED were often housed there. The problem was that the flow of activities was very high, and the base was not always guarded with the same solidity. There were brief windows in which FOB-4 was susceptible to a massive attack, and the Vietnamese knew it. For this offensive, the Communist Front employed the infamous sappers, its special forces soldiers trained to give their lives no matter the conditions. During the war, their reputation was cemented through brutal sacrifices. The sappers were fanatical communists willing to do anything, recapturing the fighting spirit of the old kamikazes of Imperial Japan. Such was their determination for their land that they wore a white bandana on their forehead with the words, "We came here to die," written in blood. On the morning of August 23, 1968, a Viet Cong battalion made up of sappers and regular soldiers entered FOB-4. Their strategy had been considered down to the last detail, so much so that the offensive coincided with the night when the new lunar cycle began. This ensured total darkness for them to move like hunters throughout the Vietnamese jungle. News of the attack spread little by little as shots and explosions echoed in every corner of the territory. Let's listen to veteran Gene Pugh tell what it was like to cross the camp in the middle of a hail of enemy gunfire.
And I hear is bang, bang. Got you, son of a bitch. And then the next breath, I'm hit, I'm hit, I'm hit. So I go out and start dragging him into the barracks, and I could feel the bullets going by my bare torso and snapping right next to my ear. It's an experience that you just wish that they could hit you instead of feeling it that way.
The Spike Team Rattler reconnaissance team was stationed at the top of the Marble Mountains, one of the highest places in Da Nang. The MASS4CRED commandos were enjoying a peaceful night when suddenly a series of rumblings turned the moment into a nightmare. Below, several meters from their positions, the Viet Cong battalion had penetrated the scarce defenses, starting a real massacre. Within minutes, FOB-4 was transformed into a bonfire filled with U.S. corpses. Only a few structures survived the offensive. While the members of the aforementioned Spike Team Rattler reconnaissance team observed all the horror from above, a part of the Vietnamese squad was preparing to ambush them. The sappers used ropes to climb in a few minutes, taking their victims completely by surprise. By the time the climbing team managed to surround Spike Team Rattler, the situation at the entire FOB-4 base had become a true hell on earth. There were tents on fire, lifeless bodies on the ground, and blood mixed with mud and vegetation. In this chaos, North Vietnamese troops ran carrying assault rifles. In one of the most shocking situations, a group of sappers with explosives attached to their bodies ran into the base's ammunition depot. Within seconds, an explosion ended their lives in the weapons reserve of FOB-4. Imagine seeing with your own eyes how a completely deranged enemy soldier runs towards an explosives depot, sacrificing his life to leave you without weapons. This type of kamikaze attack ended up becoming something characteristic during North Vietnamese ambushes. The sappers entered with dynamite or bombs on their bodies to destroy U.S. bunkers and strategic positions. As the first rays of the sun illuminated the base, the Viet Cong troops retreated, leaving only devastation behind. Among the ruins of what had been an important American military post, the bodies of 17 Green Berets were found, as well as dozens of wounded, some seriously. Due to the top-secret nature of their work, the eliminated Americans did not have an official funeral service in Southeast Asia. The next ambush we will discuss was not carried out against elite units, but against Marines operating on the banks of the Ong Thon River on the morning of October 17, 1967. During the first months of 1967, the Vietnamese front suffered the loss of thousands of soldiers as a result of the so-called search and destroy missions carried out by the United States Army. But General Tran Van Tra suggested that the communist troops could still achieve victory if they managed to inflict heavy losses on the Americans. That is why, in mid-1967, the 7th and 9th Divisions of the North Vietnamese Army began to plan what would be one of their most brutal and effective offensives. The Ong Thon River runs through a forested region with lots of vegetation, making it an ideal place to hide. With that in mind, on October 16, 1967, a patrol of soldiers from Alpha Company was sent to survey the region. During their mission, they encountered a small enemy unit, which escaped after a brief firefight. Upon reporting this encounter, Uncle Sam's men received a specific order. They were to find this group of Vietnamese and annihilate them. Part of the plan was for them to advance through occupied territory. Upon finding Viet Cong settlements, they were to contact the artillery batteries waiting a few miles away. The problem was that the local warriors had already noticed the plan and were waiting for the right moment to attack, like a predator watching its prey. One of the American soldiers did not have a good feeling about the operation.
Well, they told us we were going to a place that was going to be pretty rough, and that's all. They didn't tell us what was waiting on us. You had no choice, you just went.
At around 10 a.m. on October 17, 1967, American soldiers encountered Viet Cong troops. As we anticipated, the Asians were waiting in bunkers scattered in strategic areas of the jungle, surrounding the path along which their rival was advancing. When the Americans came within range, chaos broke out. A storm of rifle cartridges, machine guns, and grenades erupted in a deadly ambush. Washington's troops had no time to take up defensive positions and suffered massive losses of personnel during the first minutes of combat. Viet Cong men came from all sides, taking advantage of their bunkers and the geography they knew so well. As the North Vietnamese fire increased, the American soldiers thought they heard the distinctive sound of an M60 machine gun. The men assumed it was cavalry that had come to rescue them, so they ceased fire for fear of hitting one of their own. The Asian front took full advantage of this moment of weakness. At about 11:30 a.m., they sent in reserves of Vietnamese personnel who were waiting for the right moment to act. To make matters worse for the Americans, it was impossible to use artillery, as the proximity of their own to their enemies made it too risky.
Alpha Company disappeared. And now the firing was directed against us, against Delta Company.
Lúc đó thì trung đoàn mới tung cái tiểu đoàn 2 là tiểu đoàn dự bị trong ngày, đánh từ sườn bên phải đánh sang đội hình của địch.
At the same time as this part of the offensive, another group of Asian troops had advanced stealthily to the vicinity of the artillery. When the time came, they pounced on the enemy, further complicating the support that the rest of the Americans ambushed in the Ong Thon region could receive. The members of that artillery battalion remember how chaotic that situation was. On the one hand, they had to coordinate the shots and receive information from the soldiers who were further ahead. On the other, they had to defend themselves from the waves of Vietnamese who tried to take over the position. What better way to listen to North Vietnamese Colonel Vo Minh Triet describing the strategy used by his men?
Cái anh tiểu đoàn cũng có cái đài quan sát của anh, rồi anh trung đoàn có cái đài quan sát của anh, tức là những cái đài leo lên trên cao. Các cái bộ đàm này có trực đầy đủ không mới gọi. Cứ để cho đổ xuống rừng, khi kéo vào đến một cái tầm là nổ súng rồi.
One of the artillery observers, that is, those men in charge of surveying the landscape and translating it into concrete data for launching attacks, was Lieutenant Harold Pinky Durham. He was an experienced soldier who was on his second tour in Vietnam. He adopted a dangerous position, exposing himself to hostile fire coming from several directions, but it was necessary so that he could communicate with the rest of the troops and coordinate the artillery attacks. Durham calmly and quietly carried out his work, providing precise coordinates that managed to blow up several Vietnamese positions. Unfortunately, during combat, the brave soldier stepped on a Claymore-type mine, which does not explode, but does launch hundreds of metal pieces that pierce the victim's body. Durham suffered very serious injuries, and due to that incident, he was left blind in one of his eyes. With his vision flooded with blood and his body lacerated, the lieutenant continued to operate effectively, providing coordinates by radio even when the bullets grazed his head. Thanks to this man's sacrifice, North Vietnamese forces were unable to complete their massacre as they could no longer advance on the soldiers who had been ambushed further ahead. On that fateful day in October, Durham saved hundreds of lives. Listen to the description of Captain Carl Kaiser, who was part of the engagement and survived to reconstruct the initial events.
And one of the members of the flank security reported hearing movement and hearing a metallic click on his right flank. At that time, a machine gun opened fire on the right file of the 1st Platoon of Alpha Company.
That's the first shots that were heard.
That's correct.
As the American troops managed to organize and regain ground, the Viet Cong soldiers began to retreat. The bulk of the Asian column ceased hostilities and left the area about 2 hours after the hell began. They could return home satisfied, having more than fulfilled their mission, as they managed to inflict brutal damage on the American ranks. In total, Ong Than's offensive claimed the lives of 56 Washington soldiers. Another 75 were wounded, and 2 remain missing to this day. Among the dead was the heroic Harold Durham, who received the legendary Medal of Honor posthumously for his dedication and sacrifice to ensure the survival of his comrades. The Vietnam War was brutal, but it is precisely in these extreme conditions that heroism and military ability flourish. That is why the last ambush that we will review in this video also has a recipient of the legendary Medal of Honor as a participant. Let's put ourselves in time and space. On August 25, 1968, members of the American 48th Transport Group were carrying out their important job, transporting supplies to prevent soldiers from starving to death. On that day, the convoy was particularly large, with a total of 81 trucks that left the town of Long Binh loaded with food, fuel, and weapons. As you can imagine, the roads that connected Vietnam at that time were not exactly gems of modern engineering. Quite the opposite. They were winding and precarious roads that linked the starting point to Saigon, the final destination of the 48th Transport Group. Around noon, the convoy entered the village of Ap Nai, a small rubber tree plantation that stretched along the only passable road. There was a column of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the southern front that allied itself with the United States. Their presence was something to be expected, since these troops collaborated with the pacification of communities like the one they were passing through. Within a few minutes, the convoy already occupied the entire extension of the village. When the first trucks began to leave Ap Nai, the presumed soldiers, friends of Uncle Sam, revealed their true identity. They were Viet Cong men, armed to the teeth to rid the drivers and elements of the 48th Transport Group. Not only did they have surprise on their side, but the Asians had posted snipers on both sides of the road, placing all the American vehicles in the deadly zone. the most vulnerable part in an ambush. The Battle of Apni was not limited to gunfire. The communist soldiers also used machine guns and RPG-7 launchers to destroy the vehicles. The primary objective was to cut off the supply of provisions and, if possible, capture some of the loot to feed the Viet Cong with weapons and food. After spraying the trucks carrying food with bullets, the attackers' fury focused on the fuel tankers, waiting for them to explode and completely block the convoy's advance. In this part of the story, we will meet the great hero who emerged in the midst of this chaos. William Say was a truck driver of only 19 years old. Thanks to his skills behind the wheel, he became a member of the transport company, but that did not mean he did not know how to fight. When the shooting broke out in Apni, the boy jumped out of his vehicle and looked for the rest of his companions to organize the response. In an ambush, it is essential to stay calm and act by listening to your head, not the fear roaring in your stomach. Say and other drivers positioned themselves 6 meters away from each other, adopting a defensive position to repel the first attack of the Vietnamese soldiers. The boy opened fire and killed 2 enemies who were about 10 meters away. Meanwhile, one of his companions managed to eliminate a Viet Cong soldier, but then his M16 jammed and was unusable. However, the death of the 3 communists scared away a small group of guerrillas who were approaching the trucks. William C. played a prominent role in protecting his comrades at Apni. First, he fearlessly threw hand grenades that drove the enemy back. The North Vietnamese assumed there were several men, but it was just Say holding his own. During this time, the boy was shot in the wrist and bled out throughout the day. Still, he managed to drag several wounded comrades to safety under a hail of enemy shells. It is hard to imagine the bravery and resolve it takes to repeatedly expose yourself to painful death to save others. It was for this, as well as for eliminating several Viet Cong soldiers, that William received the Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, the 19-year-old ended up dying from multiple wounds that caused massive blood loss. The ambush was incredibly long, with intermittent hostilities that extended over 9 hours of that infamous August 25th. This gave enough time for the U.S. Air Force and artillery to show up, showering the communist guerrillas with fire and destruction. Finally, at 9 p.m., a large infantry unit arrived to assist the rear of the convoy. Seeing themselves outnumbered, the North Vietnamese retreated into the jungle. In total, 30 Americans died, 45 were wounded, and 2 were taken prisoner, making this episode one of the deadliest of the entire conflict. Throughout this installment, it became clear that material or numerical superiority are not always the most powerful cards. Ambushes and surprise attacks can be a deadly tool that balances the scales. The United States learned this the hard way during its intervention in Vietnam. In the heart of the dense eastern jungle, amidst the brutality and chaos of the Vietnam War, a battle took place that would go down in history. This event would be seared into memory as one of the most decisive moments of the conflict. We're talking about the incident at Forward Operating Base 4, better known by its acronym FOB4, and the impressive ambush it suffered at the hands of the Viet Cong. Join us as we explore the events that led to this trap taking place, costing the United States military its most significant single-day casualty. Get ready to delve into a jungle full of dangers and ruthless enemies. Welcome to military history. Before we tell you about the tragedy suffered by American soldiers, we believe you should know about the location where the trap unfolded, as well as the profile of the combatants who faced off in this challenge. We'll briefly develop this information so you can understand the true magnitude of the ambush. During the Vietnam War, an elite group operated under a veil of secrecy. This was the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, better known as MASS4CRED. Forged in the crucible of unconventional warfare, these soldiers were the ghosts that haunted the jungle, executing high-risk missions that defied logic and altered the conditions of the battlefield. Established in 1964, it became the spearhead of U.S. covert operations. Their tasks ranged from strategic reconnaissance in North Vietnam and Laos to the capture of prisoners and the rescue of downed pilots. They even ventured into hostile territory to free prisoners of war in bold liberation exercises. More than mere soldiers, MASS4CRED members were survival experts, demolition specialists, masters of stealth, and linguists fluent in the languages of Southeast Asia. Their training was brutal, forging an unbreakable brotherhood among those who dared to defy the impossible. Their actions were as varied as they were lethal. They participated in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the trigger for U.S. intervention in the war on a large scale. They were present in Operation Steel Tiger, the Tet Offensive, which we'll discuss later, and the Cambodian campaign, leaving an indelible mark on the course of the conflict. Psychological operations were also part of their arsenal, using propaganda and information warfare to undermine enemy morale and sow discord among their ranks. Known for their motto, audacity and professionalism, MASS4CRED individuals became legends. Their feats, shrouded in mystery, fueled the public's imagination and generated an aura of invincibility. As the operational site of this spectacular elite force, FOB 4 was a key component in the network of military missions carried out by U.S. Special Forces. Located in central Vietnam, near the border with Laos and Cambodia, this settlement stood as a bastion of resistance and determination amid the dense Vietnamese jungle. It was conceived as an advanced base for special forces, providing a strategic launching point for conducting covert missions and tactical operations in areas controlled by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. Its strategic location allowed U.S. troops to project power in the region and conduct raids behind enemy lines. The construction and maintenance of FOB 4 represented a significant logistical and operational challenge for U.S. forces. Situated in a hostile and inaccessible environment, it required the construction of basic infrastructure such as airstrips, shelters, and warehouses to ensure effective functioning. In addition to serving as a launching pad for tactical operations, it also fulfilled command and control functions, coordinating the activities of units deployed in the area and serving as a center for communications and strategy. Its ability to maintain connectivity between deployed forces on the ground was crucial for the success of maneuvers in the region. This site was also the temporary home for hundreds of U.S. soldiers who lived and worked in difficult and dangerous conditions. The base was constantly threatened by enemy attacks, requiring extreme vigilance and reinforced security measures to protect its personnel and equipment. Let's hear the testimony of a soldier speaking about the armament they had at their disposal.
Light anti-tank weapons. They'd never been used before against tanks. This was the first time in the history of the weapon that they were ever used. So we thought we were okay for a couple of tanks.
One of the main functions of FOB-4 was to serve as a launching platform for covert missions and tactical operations in enemy territory. These special forces conducted sabotage tasks and captured high-value targets. MASS4CRED units carried out aerial and ground reconnaissance missions in areas controlled by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. These activities provided them with crucial information about enemy troops and their movements, allowing for the planning and execution of actions with greater precision and effectiveness. In addition to covert operations, FOB-4 also played a crucial role in gathering and analyzing intelligence. Counterintelligence and reconnaissance units deployed at the base collected data on enemy activities. They also analyzed movement and behavioral patterns, providing real-time reports to operational forces in the field to design tactics and strategies aimed at dismantling Charlie, as Americans referred to their Asian opponents. Utilizing information gathered by intelligence units, U.S. forces planned and executed capture and elimination operations against enemy targets. In addition to its operational and intelligence functions, as mentioned earlier, FOB-4 also provided logistical and communication support to all forces deployed in the area. The base served as a distribution center for supplies and equipment, ensuring that units in the field had the necessary resources to carry out their missions effectively and safely. Testimonials from veterans who served in this stronghold highlight the importance of this location in the success of operations in the Eastern Territory. Soldiers praise the dedication and professionalism of their comrades in arms, who significantly contributed to the safety and well-being of the young men giving their lives for the cause supported by their country. However, the infallibility of this place and its specialized soldiers would face a night of nightmare.
The ground began to shake. When the next trip flare went off, they were under attack.
August 23, 1968, was a dark and humid night in the Vietnamese jungle as Viet Cong troops prepared to launch their surprise attack on Forward Operating Base 4. The moon barely managed to filter through the thick foliage of the trees, while the sound of jungle nightlife filled the air with an ominous buzz. It was the sound of war and death. Seizing the darkness to stealthily advance towards the American defenses, Charlie moved cautiously, prepared to kill. The Eastern guerrilla had been observing FOB-4 for days, gathering information on patrols and movements of American forces. They knew the time to strike was at night. Darkness provided them with perfect cover to launch their surprise assault against the base. Meanwhile, the American troops available on site were on high alert. They had received intelligence reports about the presence of the Viet Cong in the area and believed they were prepared to repel any enemy attack. Soldiers remained at their posts, weapons ready for combat, nerves generating maximum tension. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the violent sound of gunfire and explosions in the distance. The attack began with an intense barrage of mortars and rockets. Explosions illuminated the night and sowed chaos among the American and South Vietnamese soldiers defending the base. The Viet Cong had launched their assault, leveraging their knowledge of the jungle to advance swiftly towards FOB-4 and open fire on American defenses. The battle that ensued was fierce and chaotic. Violence reigned in the air, and the clamor of bullet casings bouncing on the ground echoed like death knells. Trained troops fought bravely to repel the enemy assault, firing from their fortified positions and hurling grenades at the Viet Cong ranks. The noise of explosions resonated in the jungle as bursts of shrapnel illuminated the darkness. It was a grotesque spectacle. Let's hear the testimony of one of the survivors. Despite the ferocity of the enemy attack, U.S. forces held their ground. They demonstrated time and again their bravery and determination, resisting the Viet Cong's attempts to take control of FOB-4 against all odds. It's worth noting that those holding the fortress were the best trained and most prepared troops in the American Army in the territory. Had they been less experienced soldiers, the enemy incursion would likely have been much more effective and swift. The battle raged on for hours, with both sides suffering significant losses in the process. Although the Viet Cong managed to inflict casualties on U.S. forces, they couldn't break through their defenses and were forced to retreat under heavy fire from the resistance's weapons. The consequences of the ambush were felt across the front lines. U.S. forces redoubled their efforts to protect FOB-4 and strengthen their defenses against future enemy attacks. At the same time, the Viet Cong suffered considerable losses in men and resources, undermining their ability to carry out such offensive operations in the region. It was clear that, despite being a bloody confrontation, both sides suffered the horrors of war equally. For this reason, the ambush at FOB-4 ended up being a decisive event in the Vietnam War. While the Viet Cong didn't manage to capture the base, the attack demonstrated the determination and combat capability of enemy forces. Furthermore, it served as a grim reminder of the dangers faced by U.S. troops in the Vietnamese jungle and the need to maintain constant vigilance at all times. This incursion greatly affected the morale of U.S. troops. The war already had little popular support, with most Americans considering it a mistake to participate in a conflict that didn't directly affect their country's interests. They saw it as a political conflict, and many watched their young sons, brothers, or partners go to die for something that didn't quite make sense. This ambush symbolized that idea to some extent. Being in the middle of the Vietnamese jungle, relentlessly besieged by enemy bullets due to an unfounded decision by the president, was more than soldiers could bear. But that wasn't the only event that would deeply mark this story. A few months earlier, the Tet Offensive would be set in motion. It was dawn on January 31, 1968. An expectant silence hung over South Vietnam. Suddenly, the roar of explosions and the thunder of machine guns shattered the stillness. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, in a coordinated and audacious invasion, had launched a simultaneous attack on over 100 American cities and military outposts. It was the beginning of the siege. Tet, or the Vietnamese New Year, was supposed to be a time of peace and ceasefire. U.S. and South Vietnamese soldiers, confident in the military superiority of their side, were getting ready to celebrate. However, the enemy had other plans. Taking advantage of the festivities, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army attacked fiercely, catching the Allied forces by surprise. The battle for Hue, the ancient imperial city, became one of the bloodiest episodes of the Tet Offensive. For weeks, Vietnamese forces entrenched themselves in the city, waging a fierce house-to-house resistance. U.S. Marines, sent to regain control, faced a fierce struggle where every alley became a battlefield. The Tet Offensive, though ultimately quelled by Allied forces, had a profound impact on the war. Images of destruction and American casualties, broadcasted on television worldwide, sparked strong anti-war sentiment in the American public that also led to the ambush at FOB 4 months later. Confidence in victory, which had until then been unquestionable, began to erode. President Lyndon B. Johnson, pressured by the public and aware of the growing human and economic cost of the war, announced he would not seek re-election. The Tet Offensive had shown that victory would not be easy or quick, and that the American people were not willing to endure an endless conflict.
What I see when I look at that photo today are 7, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, badly wounded. It's painful to look at.
The repercussions of this event extended beyond the battlefield. The Vietnam War became a symbol of imperial arrogance and the futility of foreign military intervention. The anti-war movement gained strength worldwide, inspiring new generations to fight for peace and justice. Despite its military outcome, this milestone marked a symbolic victory for the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. It demonstrated their organization and resilience and exposed the weaknesses of the U.S. strategy. From that moment on, the war began to tilt in favor of communist forces, ultimately culminating in the fall of Saigon in 1975. The Viet Cong's incursion came at a high cost. 32 of their soldiers died in battle. On the side of the MASS4CRED Special Forces, 17 of their men lost their lives, the highest single-day casualty toll in American military history. This demonstrates that even the most prepared troops cannot always prevail against the ferocity of battle and an army willing to do anything to fight for a cause, defending their land.
Do you remember the first time you killed someone?
Yeah.
In the turbulent year of 1968, the conflict in Vietnam witnessed one of the many dark chapters that marked the history of the North American Navy. Many brutal acts, such as the My Lai massacre to cite an example, were perpetrated by its soldiers. Truly monstrous events happened during this war. The surprising thing was that American morality saw them as an anomaly and not as a common practice. However, evidence has been found to suggest that these types of abhorrent war crimes were the rule rather than the exception. Atrocities committed by the U.S. military appear to have been the norm in the eastern country. In today's video, we are going to see the terrifying living conditions and traumas that United States troops experienced, and what the subsequent consequences were for those who managed to survive that jungle hell called Vietnam. Get ready for a trip to the most explosive and dangerous jungle of the 20th century, where you not only have to take care of insect bites, but also bullets. Welcome once again to Military History. In the midst of a war where the need to win hearts and minds was often cited, the U.S. military focused almost exclusively on one metric that would define the success of its troops in Vietnam: the body count, i.e., the number of enemies killed in combat. The Vietnamese forces, outgunned and outstrategized by their opponents, relied on tactics that involved mines and other explosive traps, as well as sniper fire and ambushes in the middle of an extremely hostile jungle unknown to the attackers. Their strategy was based on attacking and withdrawing immediately, so as not to give the American soldiers a chance to respond. Faced with the inability to confront an adversary that determined the time and place of the confrontation, American forces immersed themselves in the indiscriminate destruction of forests, villages, and everything that had to do with Asians. The idea was that if the Americans managed to eliminate more of the Viet Cong's enemies than the Vietnamese could replace, the Easterners would naturally give up the fight. In order to encourage troops to obtain high enemy casualties in the Vietnam War, competitions were established between different units to determine who could inflict the most casualties. A macabre game that the lieutenants of the United States Armed Forces promoted in a sinister way in the ranks of their young soldiers. Rewards for greatest achievements were displayed as banners. They were shown on what were known as death boards, which were tables where each unit wrote down their murders. Prizes included days off or an extra case of beer. Cigarettes were also an extremely coveted prize. In parallel, commanders who achieved these goals with their troops could ensure rapid promotion within the military team. Quickly, the slogan, "If he is dead and he is Vietnamese, he is VC," crowned by the acronym with which the Americans called the Viet Cong, this phrase became a characteristic motto of the war, and the bodies of civilians were regularly recorded as enemy or Viet Cong casualties. Ordinary people, including women and children, lost their lives trying to escape from soldiers or helicopter gunships that had fired warning shots, or simply because they were in a village suspected of harboring the enemy. At that time, many of these actions were not reported, but they did not go unnoticed either, as they were encouraged by higher-ups. It should be noted that those who carried out these dark actions were not always really aware of what they were doing. That was because many times they were just young boys who believed they were defending their country. At the crossroads of a destiny marked by war, some American citizens volunteered to embark for Vietnam. However, among the ranks of deployed soldiers, many did not make the decision by choice, but were recruited without the possibility of deferring their service because they were not pursuing a university degree. Most of these young warriors did not question the draft or the legitimacy of the conflict in Vietnam. Inspired by the tradition of their fathers and grandfathers, who had served in various wars for the nation, these fighters felt it was their duty to continue that legacy. The lack of options and patriotic duty pushed them towards the front lines.
Outside of war, is mostly never justified. But in war, neither side deserves to die, honestly. I mean, that guy over on that side is fighting for what he believes in, and you're fighting for what you believe in, and both have families and children probably, and you know.
The fight against communism, one of the central axes of the war, was not questioned by many, since they did not fully understand the dimension of the conflict. Whether facing the Viet Cong or the Russian ballet, they were willing to follow the orders of their government, feeling that they belonged to something greater than themselves and that they must do their duty. Among the probable tasks, the possibility of being assigned to the feared Black Lions Battalion did not deter them either. This unit was a bloodthirsty assault troop to which the Easterners had particular animosity. Its reputation was such that it was said that the Viet Cong offered juicy rewards for each soldier killed in combat by this troop. They even put a price on their bones. However, the idea of danger did not occupy space in the minds of these young people in their 20s. Due to the unconsciousness of youth, They all shared a feeling of invulnerability that drove them to bravely face the unknown. The problem was that the actions they were going to be forced to carry out would leave much more serious consequences than the physical ones, but we will delve into that topic later. On the battlefields of Vietnam, these anonymous young warriors were faced with a series of challenges, as terrible as they were complex for a novice soldier. Gradually brought in as replacements into existing units, they found themselves disconnected, isolated in an environment where the lines between friend and foe were constantly blurring. Everything was hostile. Everything was danger. On more than one occasion, one of the rookie soldiers sensed a threatening presence and shot reflexively, sometimes wounding a comrade and in other cases directly ending his own life.
One minute you have somebody walking along, and next there's just a lump of flesh.
With no geographical boundaries to distinguish between allies and threats, distrust reigned in the hearts of each of the beginners. Seemingly innocent villagers could be civilians or Viet Cong sympathizers, and seemingly safe areas could become dangerous zones in a matter of moments. The frustration of the new arrivals was compounded as they felt that the higher-ups, comfortable in their safe helicopters, were pressuring the soldiers on the ground to move faster and eliminate more enemies. The rivers of blood that ran through the hands of these boys carried a cartridge of guilt that would be fired a long time later. After exhausting days traversing the jungle with backpacks weighing more than 20 kilograms, the soldiers faced the possibility that a general, without understanding the reality of the terrain, would criticize the way in which they had established their perimeter, ignoring the complexities of war, in which they were immersed. These systematic abuses and mistreatment also aggravated the already tiring experience of being at the heart of a murderous war. As if these manic conditions were not enough, in this chaotic scenario, the troops suffered from an extra disadvantage. The rules of war have existed since time immemorial. These are basic codes of coexistence in any conflict, such as not attacking hospitals or civilians who are minors, the elderly, or women. The problem was that they were written in English, and the Viet Cong, called Charlie by the Americans, did not understand or respect these tacit war agreements. For this reason, he acted unpredictably, annihilating those who believed they were in a safe zone or in some type of implicit truce. In the dense confines of the Vietnamese jungle, most American soldiers lived out their year-long tours without witnessing terrifying large-scale battles or facing the dread of an ambush. However, when those times came, the lack of experience and training often proved fatal for dozens of men in a matter of minutes. For Mike Troyer, an interim squad leader in Delta Company, the ambush of October 17, 1967, marked a brutal milestone just 3 months after he arrived in Vietnam. On that fateful day, the difference between shadow and sun determined life or death. Crouching behind an anthill, Troyer sought refuge in the darkness, watching helplessly as the shots hit his most exposed companions until he ended the shooting. Advancing later across the battlefield, his mission became heartbreaking. Find someone alive among the unrecognizable bodies, pierced by projectiles. He could only identify a companion by a tattoo, since his body and face were completely disfigured. The little that remained of those soldiers, abandoned on the ground, became a grim reminder on Vietnamese soil. Their bodies, never recovered, became ghosts that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. These conditions were the perverse breeding ground that generated an outbreak of excessive violence and inhumane actions by young American combatants. Psychologically broken, these boys were willing to do anything to end the war and return home.
It goes from something, a big something, to the smallest nothing that there can be. It goes from dreams and aspirations to nothing. You know, you can kick it, you can hit it with a stick, you can throw rocks on it, you can do anything, and it won't bother it because it's dead.
An intricate web of war crimes research at the U.S. National Archives during a 2001 exploration of post-traumatic stress disorder in Vietnam veterans, revealed a treasure trove of reports that had been long buried and forgotten. Silent witnesses to the horrors of the conflict, these boxes housed files from criminal investigations and everyday documents that offered a disturbing insight into the events that occurred during that turbulent period. Among the yellowed pages, some recounted in a vivid and chilling manner the details of atrocities committed, while others only hinted at terrible events that had gone unnoticed. The U.S. military deployed an impressive arsenal of lethal power, destructive force, and advanced technology, surpassing in magnitude any other military in the history of the world. The amount of ammunition fired per soldier was a staggering 26 times greater in Vietnam than during World War II. At the end of the conflict, the United States had dropped the equivalent of 640 atomic bombs on Vietnam, like those it had dropped on Hiroshima, leaving an indelible mark on the history and memory of that nation. These abstract data on paper were deaths carried out, bloody scenes and torture experienced firsthand by the American warriors. Across vast regions, entire villages were targeted by intensive artillery bombardment, devastating airstrikes and helicopter gunship assaults, before ground forces embarked on search and destroy missions to wipe out what remained of the enemy. The command of the superiors was simple, plus, kill everything that moves. The phrase became a directive in the mouths of some American commanders, whose troops carried out massacres in various parts of their area of operations, often against their own will. Plus, women, children, and the elderly, all of them civilians, were the ones who suffered the deadly consequences. As if it were poetic justice, the ghosts of these victims would return to haunt the soldiers, but it is a theme that we will develop later in the video. Although the United States suffered more than 58,000 casualties in the war, it is estimated that approximately 2 million Vietnamese civilians lost their lives, while another 5.3 million were wounded, and around 11 million, according to U.S. government data, were forced to flee, become refugees in their own land. Collective memory often recalls the My Lai massacre in March 1968, where more than 500 civilians were brutally murdered in a span of 4 hours, even as the already dehumanized and cynical U.S. troops took a lunch break. However, it is also imperative to remember equally bloody operations like Speedy Express, which, thanks to cover-up at the highest levels of the U.S. military, remained in the shadows until the beginning of the 21st century. In late 1968, the 9th Infantry Division, under the command of General Julian Ewell, unleashed a large-scale operation in the heart of the Mekong Delta, densely populated southern Vietnam. In a context already obsessed with body counts, Ewell, known as the Butcher of the Delta, stood out even more. He fired subordinates who did not meet the daily kill quota he demanded and unleashed devastating firepower on a region teeming with civilians.
I was down, and all I could see was his head and shoulders. He had a hard hat on. And then I saw the red emblem. It was. And then when I could see a silhouette, I blasted them. Silhouettes. They're not real people, they're just targets.
A brave whistleblower from the division approached the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, William Westmoreland, requesting an urgent investigation. He detailed that the artillery aimed at the villages had taken the lives of women and children. The armed helicopters terrorized the farmers, forcing them to flee, and then massacred them from the air, playing challenges of aim and success. Troops on the ground replicated the brutality, spiraling a whirlwind of violence that seemed to have no end. The result was a series of massacres on an industrial scale, equivalent, in Ewell's words, to 1 My Lai every month. When the operation came to an end, Ewell's division boasted of having annihilated more than 11,000 enemy, but the number of weapons captured was barely more than 750. This showed that, at most, that was the number of Vietnamese that actually represented a threat to Americans. Westmoreland chose to ignore the whistleblower, dismiss any incipient investigation, and conceal the files, although an internal Pentagon report recorded some of the most incriminating accusations. The clandestine investigation into Speedy Express remained classified for decades until it was unearthed at the National Archives. According to military estimates, a minimum of 7,000 confirmed civilians perished during the operation. Even more revealing, the analysis unmasked that the U.S. High Command, with its vast experience in large-scale combat missions in Southeast Asia, recognized the inevitability of suffering significant civilian casualties when carrying out extensive deployments in densely populated areas such as the Delta. In this way, it was established that the majority of soldiers were sent to Vietnam, nothing more than to become cold-blooded killers who mowed down entire populations of innocent civilians. Survivors of a massacre by U.S. Marines in Quang Tri Province recounted what it meant to huddle in an underground bomb shelter as gunshots and grenade explosions echoed above. In addition to the fear of the situation, there was also the anguish of knowing that some of their relatives were being murdered above their heads. Many of the soldiers involved in these combat crimes faced a court-martial back in the United States. The military did not want to draw attention to the atrocities committed in Vietnam, so most were acquitted of murder charges. This generated administrative peace in the ranks of the Army, but left the troops with an enormous and sinister burden of conscience.
I didn't give a fuck who he was. I was trying to keep me alive. It wasn't me and a Vietnamese. It was me and anybody that's got to get, oh man, this is hard.
In the tense calm of the years after the Vietnam War, a silent battalion of survivors emerged, carrying an invisible but overwhelming weight called post-traumatic stress syndrome. American soldiers who returned home carried with them the deep scars of a war that was fought not only on the battlefields, but also in the shadows of their minds. Those inexperienced young men became bloodthirsty men in the midst of the chaotic battle. The price to pay was enduring a countless series of internal and invisible specters that would haunt them long after the echoes of the gunshots faded. At night, the sound of a crunch could transport them back to the jungle, where the darkness was tinged with danger. The distant explosions recalled not only the fury of the cannons, but also the deafening roar of emotional anguish. They could also be assaulted by Dantesque nightmares, starring the innocent civilians they had murdered, or their companions killed in the middle of the jungle. Every step in everyday life, every sound or image, immediately transported these veterans to the battlefield. Life was unbearable when seemingly harmless stimuli triggered traumatic memories. How does one regain peace of mind when he feels like he is a prisoner of war in his own mind? Fighting PTSD is not simply a matter of getting over the past. It is an ongoing war in which soldiers return to the trenches every time they close their eyes. The guilt of the bloody crimes committed is a fuel that feeds this condition. There is no uniform that can be hung in the closet to leave behind the weight of memories. Instead of shiny medals, they carry the shadows of what they saw and experienced, of what was done and what was not avoided.
If there's a hell, that's probably what it smells like there. It penetrates you and it just won't go away for a long time. It's horrible.
It is crucial to remember that behind every battle-hardened face there is a story worth telling. In the daily struggle of these warriors lies the true epic of human resilience. In each case, there will be those who think that the trauma is deserved, while in others, it will be understood that it is a tragic consequence of forcing a young person to kill. Although the war may be officially over, the battle against PTSD continues for those who carried the weight of the nation on their shoulders, as well as the blood of innocent people on their hands. This is how we are finishing today's video. We thank you for reaching the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installments of Military History.